You're watching FPAC Channel 9. I'm Susan Kessel and Connie Boyer are your hosts today, and we have with us special guest Charles Borden. You're watching Opening Fairfield Doors, and our mission statement: by opening the doors into the lives of the people and places of our community, we will strive to promote awareness, understanding, and appreciation for others.
Great. I've been getting some comments when I've been out at the store and stuff that people are enjoying some of these interviews that we're doing, so I'm really thrilled to hear about that. And so keep giving us positive feedback. We enjoy that.
Yes.
So today we're going to talk about Russia and how it connects with Fairfield. And our guest today is Charles Borden, and he lives in Fairfield but spends much of his time in Russia with some of his businesses. So we're going to get there, but first, before we get to that point, let's, Charlie, tell us about where you grew up and went to school, and then how you started thinking about connecting a business in Russia.
I grew up mostly in the Midwest, in Illinois and Minnesota. I went to college at Iowa State University. I graduated in civil engineering from Iowa State University in 1971. I moved around quite a bit after that, and I moved back to Fairfield briefly moved to Fairfield briefly in 1974, and then moved back again to Fairfield in 1986. I lived, I think, a fair amount of time before that in California.
Mm-hmm.
I got involved in business in Russia in 1992 after meeting some people from an agricultural institute outside of Moscow in Fairfield in 1991.
And what were they here for?
The director of the Agricultural Institute, which is one of the largest ones in Russia, came here to visit the MIU campus. He was here for about a week, and then I spent several days with him traveling around Iowa and introducing him to business and political leaders in Iowa. He went back to Russia. At that time, the Soviet Union still existed, and he was interested in developing some kinds of opportunities for his agricultural institute. So we continued some communication through email and through telephone. And then after the coup attempt in late 1991, he invited me to come to Russia. And I first went to Russia in February of 1992, which was only, at that time, about 6 weeks after the Soviet Union had disappeared.
That was in 92?
In 1992.
Okay, for frame of reference here.
The Soviet Union's last day was the last day of 1991. After that, it became Russia and I think 13 other countries, Ukraine and so on, and with Boris Yeltsin as the president of Russia.
So what was he trying to accomplish in his institute exactly?
It's, this particular institute is, you could call it a trade or vocational institute. Students worked with institute by correspondence. They came from all over Russia. They would take courses in their own communities through local institutes and through correspondence, and then eventually they would come to Moscow and attend the institute there for 6 weeks or a year or a number of months. And they had various curriculums in agriculture-related areas. The institute is located just about 20 miles east of Moscow.
And it's still going today then?
Yes, it is. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen this director in some time, but we stay in communication from time to time.
So then after you went and visited, did you see an opportunity that you came back and decided to start a business or connections with them?
Yes, I went to Russia not really knowing what kinds of opportunities might be there. It was more out of curiosity. And at that time, Russia, it's difficult even to explain to people today, unless they'd been there, what Russia was like in the beginning of 1992. It is so radically different than it is today. At that time, it seemed that virtually any business that you wanted to try, you could had the potential to be successful there, because there were no consumer products at all. There was no advertising at all. There was none of the things that we're accustomed to. All of Moscow, I think there were 30 gas stations, which were Soviet Union era gas stations, and with long lines and even difficult to find.
I would think that people wouldn't even know how to react once they had a, quote, free society, you know.
That's true.
After living under communism for so long, were they prepared to go out in the world and now do their own thing?
No, for the most part, people in Russia were not prepared for capitalism, for a free market system, and nor were many of the people that came from the West, the so-called advisors who were hired by the U.S. government and other governments to assist Russian business people and the Russian government in making a transition. They were mostly, no one had any experience before in this. I mean, it was totally a totally new experience, and people came from the United States, for instance, thinking that they knew what to do in Russia to make Russia a free market economy, and in fact, I think experience shows today, and I think even at the time, it was being demonstrated that these people knew very little about what to do about assisting or promoting or developing a free market system in Russia. And the Westerners who did come had really very little knowledge about Russia and the unique culture and political, economic environment in which people functioned. It is surprising to me. It's not surprising to me, but looking back now at that particular time and knowing what I know about Russia today and about the people there, it's quite a remarkable country and very much different than our instincts or our intuition might tell us that it ought to be. And one other comment, you asked if they were prepared. I don't think people in Russia thought, there were things that they didn't like about their country, and there were things that were problems for them, but I don't think that they, for the most part, Russians thought that they lived under some terrible system or that they lived in some terrible environment. There certainly were terrible times during Stalin's period when knocks came on the door in the middle of the night, but people don't view that their life was so terrible.
Right. Well, that's all they knew, right? I mean, they'd lived that way most of their life, so it was that was the way of life there.
So were you apprehensive about going there the first time?
Not really. A lot of people at that time from Fairfield had been to Russia in 1989. There was an earthquake in Armenia, and during that period of time, quite a few, I would guess several hundred people that associated with the university were in Russia and other republics of the former Soviet Union, and so a lot of people had been to Russia. I wasn't particularly apprehensive about it. I was curious about it
And
more than anything.
Do you have a family?
I have a wife.
Did she go with you?
She's been there a couple of times. She didn't go the first time, but she's been a couple times since then.
Well, I'd like to go sometime. I think I'm brave enough to go.
No, it's really a wonderful country, and there are many wonderful things about it. It's much safer than you might gather from watching television and news reports. The city of Moscow has become one of the most, I think, beautiful cities in Europe in the last 7 years. It's really remarkable the amount of construction and renovation that has gone developed with very old, very beautiful buildings. It's quite, the inner part of the city is really quite magnificent, and it's a very, very interesting and remarkable city, and many of the people are really very wonderful people. Yeah.
Great. So you have more than one business involved in Russia, one being RAAN Inc., and that stands for the Russian American Agricultural Network. Can you tell us about that business and some of the things that you're doing over there with that business?
That business, RAAN it's called, is the principal business that I started in 1992. The other businesses are, in one way or another, offshoots or related to it. At the time that I started the business there, I wanted to do, I thought quite a bit about what the most interesting opportunities would be in Russia. There are already a lot of people from Iowa had been to Russia. Iowa was the first state to have a sister state relationship with the state in Russia, with Stavropol region in the southern part of Russia. And so there were a lot of ties between Iowa and Russia, and many of them were agriculturally oriented. And in difficult times of difficult economy, food production and agriculture are extremely important, and Russia has a lot of potential in that area. So for all these and some other reasons, the connection with the Agricultural Institute there, I decided that the orientation of the business should be in that direction.
So if you have a business there, do you spend a lot of time there?
I'm now there most of the time. I would say I live in Moscow about 80% of my time. Maybe even now a little bit more than that.
And then Fairfield the rest?
Fairfield most of the rest of the time. I do travel to some other places as well that are related to the business. The focus of the business, as far as production is concerned, is in the southern part of Russia, which is about 1,000 miles south of Moscow. So I travel there quite frequently.
And what are some of the things that you're producing there then?
Well, at this time, as the business has developed, it's primarily a wine business.
Okay.
We have joint ventures with very large, old Russian wineries in the southern part of Russia.
And is that what one of these packagings are?
Yes, that was the first type of packaging that we introduced to Russia. We were the first to introduce Western style packaging of wine in Russia and bottling.
Is this the kind that comes in the bag?
Yes.
Can we see that? Because
Yeah.
I've never seen this until a couple years ago.
It was developed in Australia, this kind of packaging. And it's a cardboard carton. It holds 3 liters of wine, and you punch out the hole here, perforated hole, and inside is a foil bag like this that is especially constructed for wine, and there's a tap on it. The advantage of this type of packaging is that once you've opened the carton, you can store the wine for many weeks. If you open a bottle of wine, you have to drink it immediately. Of course, there is a tradition of Russian anyway that once you open a bottle, you have to finish it. So,
So
I'm not sure that
now
you have to
there are
finish
a
3
lot
liters
of people
here,
in
so.
Fairfield highly interested in wine, and I know that there's someone right now, Dick DeAngelis, is starting Vineyards that would have an interest in hearing about this, but I guess I didn't think
Iowa?
in Fairfield, Jefferson County. I never thought of Russia as having vineyards, and
That's I would say that's quite common because the wines there have never been exported. And but in 1980, the Soviet Union produced 3 times as much wine as the United States.
wow.
So in 1980, the U.S. produced about 1.6 billion liters of wine, and the Soviet Union produced 4.8 billion liters of wine.
Now, do Russians, do you still call them Russians?
Yes.
Okay. Are they like Europeans where they drink wine with all their meals, or is it?
No, their consumption is about the same as in the United States. At least it was as of a few years ago. The average American, I think the figure is around 6.9 liters a year of wine that they consume, the average American. The average Italian consumes almost 70 liters a year, 10 times as much as an American.
Wow.
And a Frenchman consumes a little bit less than an Italian, and I think the Germans are somewhere around 35 or 40 liters a year. So the Russian consumption is very similar to the United States.
So you're exporting this wine to Italians?
No.
Or does it stay in Russia?
It stays in Russia. So far, we have actually a number of inquiries recently for export of our wines, and we may start that. Actually, our company is the only Western company that works with Russian wineries. It somehow was worked out that way, and we have a particular niche in Russia in this area.
So do you have contracts with farmers there? I mean, how does that process work? Or do you hire these people to grow? Do you rent the land? I mean, what's that process?
The wineries in Russia are all former, mostly state farms. In the Soviet Union, they had collective and state farms. The difference is really in name, not in so much in structure, but they were communally owned. Well, State Farm is owned by the state, and each state farm had a couple of villages. The people in the village work for the state farm. And the wineries in Russia are all very large. Each of them would probably be considered 20th or 25th in size in the United States if they were here, based on their production. They each have about 2,000 acres of vineyards. I mean, you could find many wineries in Germany, for instance, that are only 2 or 3 acres of vineyards.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, and how does that compare to vineyards in California? I mean,
I think there are a lot of small ones.
there's many, many small wineries in California, and Russia does not have small wineries. There are not many wineries in Russia. I would guess right now there are under 50 operating wineries.
Now, when we were in France, one of the main reasons we were there is for my husband to go look at the wineries. Mm-hmm. They were large chateaus, and it's totally different than, say, Napa Valley, where the tourists stop in. You couldn't just stop in. It was more of a business. You had to have an appointment.
Right.
Are they large chateau type?
Well, in France, there are places in France where you can stop in, but they are, as you say, they're much rarer than in California. In Russia, they're not. You couldn't even consider them chateaus or anything resembling it. They are villages. And these are farms that not only farm grapes, but they have wheat and corn and other agricultural products. They happen to be a collective farm that also grows grapes. And the wineries themselves they call them, the word in Russian would be translated like wine factory if you translated it direct. And there's a tendency in Russia for things to be, to use terms like wine factory rather than something more elegant like winery that we might use here. These wineries, as I said, are very large, and they have, some of them are in good condition, some not in such good condition. Very few of them, or none of them, have facilities for an average visitor to stop by. The harvest is happening right now in Russia. There are 3 regions, well, really 4 regions of Russia where grapes are grown for wine. They're all in the southern part of Russia. One particular region, which is close to the Black Sea, probably produces 80% of the wines of Russia.
So you said they're in harvest. So is their climate where you're growing this about the same as ours, or is it?
Stavropol.
How does it compare to where we're at?
Or Anapa. Anapa is one of the cities on the Black Sea where I work. Is at the same latitude as Minneapolis, but it is a milder climate than Minnesota or Iowa. It's particularly along the Black Sea coast, the climate is moderated by the Black Sea.
And so then, is this produced under the RAAN name, or?
Actually, we had two marks. This is called Wines of Stavropol, this particular one. We have a joint venture with a winery in Stavropol region called Proskovea Winery, and then we have another mark called Wines of Anapa, and that's a city on the Black Sea where we work, where I have a joint venture. And we're changing our brands now. We've started a new company in Russia, and it's actually using my family name as a brand name.
Oh,
and
that's
we're
nice.
starting new joint ventures with other wineries. The newest one is actually a Greek village. Many of the people live there of Greek heritage on the Black Sea, and it's quite an interesting place to work. The wine has been produced in these areas for 2,500 years, since there were Greek villages along the Black Sea coast.
Now, I noticed English on this side. Do people speak English?
Well,
Is this a dumb question?
most people in Russia, for instance, could read this English term or could pronounce it, because almost everyone in Russia has taken English in school. Most people don't speak English, but they have had English, whereas in America, almost nobody has taken even knows what the Cyrillic alphabet looks like. Never mind actually being able to read anything. So, but many Russians have taken English, but it's not like Europe. In Europe you find many people that speak English, whereas in Russia, I would say, except for Moscow and St. Petersburg, it's fairly rare to find anyone that speaks English.
Another question about the wine, I know here, like in the Wine Spectator, they list the different, they grade the wines. Is there that type of consumerism there?
No, there are wines that people recognize. If you're Russian, there are wines that people recognize or they believe to be good wines. The taste in Russia for wines is different than it is in the West. If I had a glass of Russian, say, white wine and California white wine together, and I gave them to a Russian, they would choose the Russian wine. We would choose the California wine just by taste, as being a preference. The Russian would say that the Russian wine is better, although we'd say it was awful, probably, in many cases. So,
and I imagine as their wealth increases, or their level of living, that the levels of wine, their different appreciation will change, as it does in our country, where we have so much money, they have so little that's not a thing for them even to do or think about.
Well, there are imported wines in Russia. There are less now than there were before the economic crisis last August. There are quite a few imported wines in Russia, but as you rightly point out, Russians have very little experience with foreign wines. Certainly before the end of the Soviet Union, almost nobody had experience with foreign wines. So their experience of wine is totally oriented around their own production in their own country.
It's gotten so here that pretty much they're wine snobs.
That's right.
Sorry, Pat.
And didn't we say he was sponsoring the show? Did we say that at the beginning?
I don't think we did. Farm Bureau Insurance is sponsoring this show.
Oh boy. I think, do you want to go home tonight?
He's not home, so that'll be easy.
Oh, poor Pat. We kind of beat him up tonight.
But in this country, there are a lot of wine snobs, wine snobbery associated with that.
Well, we actually are just about to export a couple of wines from Russia that are, I believe, exportable wines. They're not, I'm sure none of this this particular wine community would find any Russian wine to be premium wine, or what they would consider an excellent wine. They also, in America, the wine community has, in the same way as in Russia, they've developed their own taste.
But
And
you know, maybe we shouldn't judge so fast. Maybe
That's
this
right.
is an undiscovered.
well, that's what I believe it is.
You might have hit upon something really hot for the future.
So tell us about, we had a little ear of corn over here, which I think fell on the floor.
Yes, which
Can
I
we-
knocked
can we
off on the
grab
floor.
that?
It's down there.
Can we see? Is it possible to grab it? And you can tell us, obviously, you're not just producing wine.
We did produce popcorn in Russia for a number of years.
Okay.
Is
We
this
don't
popcorn?
produce it now.
This is popcorn.
Yes, and that actually was grown in Russia.
Oh, you're not producing that now?
We're not producing it
But you
now.
did for a while.
We did for a
Okay.
while. And was one of the points I guess I wanted to discuss, is that the situation with agriculture in Russia is really quite awful.
And you mentioned the economic crisis in Russia last year.
In
So
August.
is this what we're talking about, what's happened since then?
Well, I think they're really
Or as a whole?
two separate subjects. The situation in agriculture has progressively gotten worse and worse every year since 1992, and I and others keep saying every year it can't get worse, and then it does the next year. And I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel with Russian agriculture. The situation is really beyond imagination. It's very, very bad, and it
Do they
has such tremendous potential in agriculture. But
They have a lot of ground, they have a lot of
they have some
resources,
of the best
but
soil in the world.
I mean, what's holding them back from producing?
The system that has been in place for over 70 years, the socialization of agriculture, the communist system and the collectivization of agriculture created just an awful situation in agriculture, and it'll take decades for it to recover. Actually, I remember when this director of this agriculture institute came to Fairfield, I took him to visit a local farmer, Don Johnson. He's retired now, but we went to the farm where his son and his grandson were there, and I remember this director of this institute remarking, he said, "This is something we've completely lost in Russia, the family tie with agriculture, where the knowledge of agriculture is passed through a family, essentially." And in Russia, everything is compartmentalized in the farms. One person drives a tractor, another person works with the hogs, and they're paid workers, and there's very little incentive for them to.
So there's not like one person that owns the farm.
That's correct.
Who owns the farm? Who owns the farm ground?
Well, in Soviet times, it was owned by the state, or in the case of a collective farm, the collective owned it, and there might have been 800 or 900 or 1,000, 2,000 members of the collective farm. Immediately after the end of the Soviet Union in 1992, the farms were privatized. By 1993, virtually all of them were privatized. The form of privatization was that all of the members of the collective and state farm, for the most part, got shares in an organization. It could be like a corporation or an association that owned the farm. It owned the land, the tractors, and facilities. It also owned things like the local hospital and the local school and the local social facilities that were collectively part of the collective farm. And the farm managers were the same farm managers who were there in Soviet times. And they were there in Soviet times, and not because they were good farmers, not because they were necessarily even good managers. They were there because they were good communists, that they were party members, that they supported the party, and so on. And these same managers took over the farms, and in only very rare instances will you find a farm that's well managed. And for the most part, and it's not just the case with the farms, it's the case with many of the industrial enterprises, the factories that were also privatized. The managers use the resources of the farm for their own private purposes.
Mm-hmm.
They borrow money from a bank and buy a car. They borrow money on behalf of the farm
Mm-hmm.
from a bank, and then buy themselves a car, or build themselves a house, or use
So there's
the
not
resource.
accountability to all the rest of the people that are supposed to
That's right. They're supposed to be,
participating.
but as during Soviet times, the ability of individuals in a collective farm to influence to influence change in the collective and state farm structure really isn't there, and they're not used to exercising their own initiative or will. They
I
don't
think
have
I
any
would
ability
find
to
this
do it.
very frustrating.
And in 1992 and 93, many people became private farmers. I remember being on a private farm not far from Moscow, and a guy came by and talked to us for a few minutes. And afterwards, the people there pointed out, did you notice that nobody else talked to this man? And then they explained to me that he was a private farmer. And that
So he had his own ground.
He had taken his
he
own
farmed by
ground.
himself.
He had taken his own ground to farm by himself, but he didn't have any equipment. He had no money to buy equipment. And in addition, the other people that were members of the collective farm, they shun him. He gets no cooperation from anybody. This was in 92 and 93. Things have changed to some degree now. But at that time, if you went off on your own, it was something that you didn't do. It was not acceptable behavior. And the farm managers discouraged this because in the Russian legislation there's a law which allows each individual to take his part of the collective farm resources, his share, as land, as equipment. But when this person got his land, his 8 acres or 10 acres, first of all, that's not large enough to farm economically. Second of all, he got 8 acres that had no road, no electricity. He couldn't live there. He lives for the most part, these people live in apartments in a village, let's say like in Fairfield, and then they have to drive 10 miles to their farm. So they have to sleep on the farm virtually to guard it against people who may decide they'd like to take something from them.
So looking ahead, I mean, what are the opportunities for agriculture that these people can do, or how we can reciprocate and help them, or are there things that we can do? What's going to pull them out of this crisis that they're in?
There's a lot of people that have tried to guess and try to understand what can be done. And at this stage, I don't know there's no easy answer to that question, and I don't think anybody has an easy answer. I'm certain that, and I think people have realized that private farmers, meaning small farmers with even 100 acres, will have a very difficult time and will continue to have a difficult time. That's not something that it'd be very difficult to predict that would be the outcome. Many people from the West came to Russia and said that all these farms should be broken up into private farms. Well, that just doesn't work. For instance, an entire 50,000 acres doesn't have any electricity or any access. They're used to not having that, whereas in Iowa, every farmstead has has electricity or has access to some water. There's not financing for agriculture there. I think ultimately that these farms will get, as some of them do now, they'll get better managers. There'll be some changes and they'll become essentially like large corporate, I guess you could call them corporate, but they'll be well-managed large farms. I think that's probably an answer. The parliament, the Duma of Russia, is very resistant to anything to do with privatization of or sale of agricultural land. So farms are not able to mortgage their land. They're not able to sell their land. For instance, they couldn't sell a few acres in the village to get money to pay for new tractors. And that probably, in the current situation, is not going to change very quickly. Because the free market political group within Russia is very much discredited right now. So it's a very complicated situation. One thing that we've been sending, there's a lot of discussion about sending agricultural products and food aid to Russia, and this, on the one hand, seemed like a wonderful idea. On the other hand, I think many people understand that the effect it will have will actually to hinder agriculture and hinder food production. In the early 80s, a huge amount of chicken was sent to Russia from the United States, and it destroyed the chicken industry in Russia. Virtually all of the chicken processing plants in Russia were closed down because they couldn't economically compete with the cheap chicken that was being sent.
So we sent them chickens just to eat. Dead chickens? I mean, live chickens?
No, dead ones. In fact, they called them bush legs. They were named after George Bush, because it was a program that was set up during the Bush administration, but it was carried over in the Clinton administration as well. Tyson, of course, from Arkansas, is a big name in that business. But some Americans I know who are in the meat business in Russia have said that this had a really devastating effect on the chicken industry.
Because now people didn't buy their chickens.
That's right, and the farms couldn't react quickly enough. They were in bad shape already, and many of virtually all of the chicken production facilities were shut down in Russia by 1995. Now what's happened the last couple of years is and even in the last year, there are investors in chicken production in Russia.
Are we still sending chicken now?
Business. We are probably sending a lot less than we were.
That sounds like
a year ago. The economic crisis.
Yeah, so tell us about that. What has happened in
things.
the last year in Russia?
Well, in August there was an economic crisis. It was the ruble was devalued, and the Russian banks and the Russian government defaulted on their debt. And it changed the Russian economy overnight. Many foreign companies, American companies, left Russia quite rapidly, particularly those that were involved in importing foreign goods. It was quite interesting how quickly people fled Russia from Western companies.
So to give us an idea of the value of money, I know bread is one item that people talk about.
Bread is very inexpensive in Russia. There are many reasons for it. Bread is a 1 kilo loaf, which is 2.2 pounds, costs right now around 20 cents.
Okay.
And it's very good bread. And there are many, in Moscow, there are probably dozens of different varieties of bread you can buy, very excellent bread.
What are some of the other values that we would relate to as far as items?
A gallon of milk or?
Well, a liter of milk, which is about the same as a quart of milk, is around 50 cents, a little over 50 cents. There are different ways of buying milk, for instance, or bread or food products in Russia, and for the most part, Russians view all of these products as expensive. They would say that the 20-cent a loaf bread is very expensive. What has changed since the economic crisis is that import food products now they dropped quite dramatically at the time of the crisis, the amount of imports, because there were defaults, people couldn't buy them anymore, and the prices of the exchange rate between rubles and dollars changed, which meant that it increased from around 5 rubles per dollar to now 25, so it's 5 times. That means an imported product is now 5 times as expensive in rubles as it was last year. Because it's imported, it has to be paid for in dollars. So if you, for instance, a bottle of beer, imported beer that cost 7 rubles before the crisis. If you're still importing it, it's going to cost 35 rubles now. Whereas a Russian beer that cost 5 rubles, maybe a little bit less than the imported beer, let's say the ratio might have been 7 and 5, now costs only 10 rubles. So the price of Russian products in the Russian currency maybe have doubled in price, but the price of foreign goods have increased by 5 times. So again, using the beer example, you could buy a bottle of Russian beer for maybe $1 and a bottle of Heineken beer for $1.20. Now you pay, still, I would pay $1.20 for the Heineken, but you can buy a bottle of Russian beer for 30 cents or 40 cents. So it's, so people are buying Russian products. And this is the result of the economic crisis actually has, I believe, and I think more and more people realize now, has a very positive effect on the Russian economy. Because now everyone is looking to buy products in Russia. You go to a foreign restaurant, they almost immediately introduce what they call a crisis menu. The crisis menu was made up of food items that all were sourced within Russia. They weren't imported. So they would make burritos, for instance, at the Mexican restaurant using Russian-grown beans, Russian-grown peppers, Russian-grown onions, and
So as far as vegetables go, they have they're able
That's
to
right.
produce that type of
That's
thing.
right.
But what about fruits?
well, apples.
Do they have that ability?
Yes. In southern Russia, apples, cherries, peaches. And then if you go further, a lot of fruits are imported from Azerbaijan and Armenia and Georgia, where they actually grow citrus fruits there. And there are in the markets a fair amount of imported oranges, even vegetables from Holland, from Israel, from European producers. It's just that they are very expensive, or at least a Russian would consider it very expensive.
So if they buy from other European countries, they still have to pay in American dollars?
Well, they pay either in American dollars or Dutch guilders or French francs, but they're a currency which, a Western currency, and nowadays it takes a lot more rubles to buy the same number
No
of
matter what
dollars.
other currency they're buying
Right.
in.
Right. So, for instance, our company is looking to buy packaging, if we can, within Russia. This is imported. That carton, I think this carton was made in Finland. And so we're now getting cartons within Russia. We can't get these bags in Russia, but we can buy bottles in Russia. Now we're starting to bottle wine. So every company is looking to source as much as possible of their products within Russia. That means that companies that are producing in Russia are getting a lot of orders. The milk producers in Moscow, before you could buy a carton of milk from Germany or Finland for just a little bit more than it cost to buy a quart of milk from Russia. Now, you couldn't. You would never buy a carton of Finnish, you'd never even see one now, Finnish or German milk, because it would cost 3 times the cost of a liter of Russian milk. And the Russian milk is quite good.
So is there opportunity then for people, from the United States to go over there and create a factory that produces a bag like that, or produces something that's made in Russia to be sold in Russia at a reasonable cost? I mean, and make that a profitable business. I mean, is that worth looking at for companies?
Well, I think there are.
Or they're just
still
hindering what's already going on over there?
There are American companies that are investing there and that are producing there. Kodak has started producing film in Russia. A number of different chocolate and ice cream companies are producing and increasing their production there. McDonald's now has just done a tremendous job. There are 45 McDonald's in Russia.
What's it cost to get a hamburger and
Oh,
french fries?
that's an interesting point. A cheeseburger is around 50 cents. If you're paying in rubles, or if you're paying in dollars, I would say it's around 50 cents. Before the crisis, it was over $1 to get a cheeseburger. Of course, you're paying in rubles, but if you convert, for foreign people to live and to work in Russia, if you have dollars to work with, it goes a lot further now. Office rent in Moscow was unbelievably expensive before the crisis. Now it's less than half of what it was in dollars before the crisis. The same with apartments. To fly to southern Russia, where I often have to fly before the crisis, cost me $120 to $130 each way. And now it costs me around $40 each way on the Russian airlines. A hotel on the Black Sea, a very nice hotel, before the crisis used to cost me $30 or $35 a night. Now it costs $7 or $8 a night. So it's much easier to make your money go further in Russia than before. But as far as opportunities for American companies, the opportunities are not the same as they were 7 years ago. And to do business in Russia requires a completely different style of working than it did before. Most foreign companies now have spent quite a bit of time training Russian employees, and they're replacing as much as possible their foreign employees with Russian employees, and that really has to be part of a plan now.
Now, you wanted to talk a little bit about the political things that are going on, some of the corruption things. We're going to end on a happy note here.
Well, I hope
I'm going
it's
to guarantee
happy.
us that.
Actually,
we're going to end on a positive note, but it seems like we're talking about a lot of challenges and stuff that they have, but that's the reality of what's going on there.
Well, I think you really, ever since I went to Russia, I've always been surprised at seeing the reality there and then seeing what's on television in the United States, how it's portrayed. And even now, I'm constantly asked, it must be terrible now and very difficult there now. But it's really actually much better there now when it was 7 years ago. I remember I had been in Russia for about a week, and I just wanted a cold soft drink. And I sent a Russian guy out to try to find a soft drink. And he came back like 3 hours later, and he couldn't even find a warm soft drink. Never mind a cold one. So there are so many things that are better about Russia and much more comfortable. It was very dirty there, particularly in '92 and '93 in Moscow, and very disorganized. There are so many things better.
Do you think the Russians welcome the influence that we're bringing in, the changes, or do some of them not? Well,
the changes that are taking place in Russia are changes that they're from within. I mean, it's the growth of the free market there and the growth of political freedom. It really is something that it's an internal process. And American culture has a big influence there. I mean, you see, it always surprises me how many, California hats and T-shirts, from the Chicago Bulls that you see in even remote parts of Russia. I'm not even sure a lot of people even know who the Chicago Bulls are, but they've got a Chicago Bulls T-shirt. So the American culture has a tremendous influence in many different countries around the world, not just Russia. And I think in many countries around the world, it's resented by many of the people, either religious leaders or political, cultural leaders. They resent the intrusion of many of the negative aspects of American culture on their own culture. And I think that's especially true in Russia. The Russians have always had a great deal of pride about their own culture and their traditions. For many years, they thought of themselves as the teachers of the world through socialism and communism. And so there is some resentment of the influence of foreign culture. But on the other side, I think they've really done a good job of integrating their own culture and adopting and accepting things from the West. And I don't think we can be so quick to judge things that we hear and things that we see. Americans tend too much. We think that we have this very broad vision and broad liberal understanding about the way things should be in the world, but it's the way we think things should be in the world, and in fact there's an awful lot of people that don't agree with us.
Right.
And most recently the war in Serbia is a very, very big example of very big misunderstanding between between two countries and two cultures about that. The popularity of Americans as a result of the war, prior to the war in Serbia, something like 75% of Russians viewed America favorably. After the war started, it dropped to 25%. And that is something we can say all we want about, the war was right, or whatever we want to say about the war in Serbia. The fact is that happened in Russia. 150 million people, if that means 75 million people decided that Russia no longer view America favorably as they did before. And it's we entered this war in Serbia without, I think, really considering a part of the world that had some other opinions about it.
And it really, it makes an impact on me thinking, because you want to be liked. It's the same old thing. Everybody wants to be liked, and that's a huge. They're such a large country, and to have that many people think of us in that light is kind of hard to swallow.
Immediately after the war started, I was there when it started in Moscow, and I didn't really understand much about it other than what I'd heard, but I had people ask me about, immediately, friends, and many of my friends are not what you would consider, my Russian friends are not, diehard communists. These are liberal, free market entrepreneur types, who have, like to have good jobs, like the West, travel to the West. I was surprised. One of them works in the embassy, the U.S. Embassy. She called me. She'd been sent home from the embassy because of the demonstrations in front of the embassy. She called me and said, "Why is America starting World War III? Why, when are they going to start bombing us?" And the Russian people really didn't understand, and really, I think in many cases, thought that this was the beginning of a war against Russia. And this is the outcome, right? We don't have to talk about whether the war was right or not right, but this is the outcome as far as Russia is concerned. There was a very deep and very strong difference in Russia. And it's not just the war, but many things that have happened in the last few years have changed Russians' opinions about Americans. You could say in 1992 and 1993, for 99.9% of Russians, every American was like a god. They were, I shouldn't use that term, but they were, held in such high esteem. And we did say we're going to talk about corruption, and will for a second. That we hear about the corruption and the scandals that are coming to light now, but these are things, a lot of these things, the average Russian knew about 7 years ago. They knew about 5 years ago. They've known about it for 3 years ago. And why? And I can't imagine that there was an American who even visited Russia that didn't know about it 3 and 5 years ago. This is nothing new. And there are Americans. Let's not be so quick to condemn Russia in this situation, or Russians in this situation. There are Americans that participated in this. And I was thinking to myself the other day when I was coming back, there are Americans, if the barn door was left open, there's an awful lot of American business people also that would have been glad to get in there and take what they could.
Are we talking organized crime, or are we just
No,
talking,
we're not talking about organized crime.
Just corruption and
This is corruption.
by individuals?
There's what we call hardcore organized crime in Russia, which is a lot like organized crime in other parts of the world, maybe even certain groups, quite vicious organized criminals. And they deal with some traditional areas of organized crime, prostitution or drugs, and but the most widespread corruption is in government circles. There was an article not long ago, at the time of, well, there were two articles by the same author in the one of the English language newspapers, and the first was about where did the communists were complaining about this fact that all this money had fled Russia. And this columnist, she said, how did the Russians know how to send money out of the country? And she went on to follow up with a very detailed analysis that they learned it from the communists. And she cited the examples that during communist times, the red directors, these are what these old communist directors of big factories and collective farms are called. They're still the same communists that were there before. And they're now directors of these private enterprises. In Soviet times, the Soviet Union had a system of sending money from these enterprises out of the country. They would do it by example. The Soviet Union wanted to sell weapons to Nicaragua. They set up, the weapons company in Russia set up an offshore company which they sold the weapons to. And then that offshore company sold the weapons to Nicaragua. And they made a profit. This offshore company made a profit on that, and that money was used to sponsor the development of the Communist Party in different countries throughout the world. So when the Soviet Union ended, all these red directors already knew how to set up an offshore company and how to export their products and make money in an offshore company. And this was something that was started by these red directors.
Mm-hmm.
They already knew what to do, and this continued, only now it was in private hands rather than something that went into the state coffers. It was in private hands afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating.
And the big, this bank issue in New York, the same author wrote an article at the time of the crisis about the banks. The banks all collapsed, they defaulted. And she said that everyone knows in banking circles that all the banks had what was called an E-plan. And the E-plan was, each bank had an E-plan that if there was a crisis, an economic crisis in Russia, that they could drain the assets, the financial assets of the bank off in a matter of hours. They already had set up offshore companies and offshore bank accounts, and they would pull the funds out of the bank and could do it almost instantly. And in fact, she went on to cite how a couple months before a bank had failed in Russia, and the directors were embarrassed in the banking community because they hadn't had a chance to put their E-plan into effect, and the Russian regulators had come in and blocked their accounts before they could take all this money out of the bank. But this is official. It's official corruption. And on the other hand, it's a tremendous problem. A company like ours doesn't have much contact with that level of financial activity. But there are, we can't entirely blame it on the Russians. There's a lot of Americans or foreigners who either would be glad or jealous that they weren't involved in the first place in this taking industrial assets and buying them in fixed auctions, and then being able to resell them for 5 and 10 times what they bought them at, or being able to control banks the way the Russians did.
Will you quickly tell us, I remember you once talking about people don't actually have bank accounts like we do here. They use the ATM machine or something like that. How does that
ATM
work?
machines are, there's a lot of them in Moscow. You can get cash night or day from an ATM machine. In Moscow, people, the average
don't
person
write
doesn't
checks.
have a checking account.
Okay, that's what it was.
And they don't have, the entire economy works mostly on cash. And I'm absolutely sure that there are more dollars in circulation in Russia than there are in the United States. I would say the average household has $2,000 or $3,000, maybe $1,000 to $2,000 somewhere stashed in their apartment, and they won't put it in a bank. And since the crisis has taken place, they
Right.
definitely won't put it in a bank for some time.
Interesting.
And it's unfortunate all that money doesn't work, because in our banking system, in our economic system, if money's in the bank, it works. It's loaned out so people can buy houses and so on. There's a huge store, billions of dollars of economic wealth that is not at work in Russia.
So I said we were going to end on a positive note. If we were going to go to Russia, where would you tell us to go and visit? What are the highlights in Moscow or Stavropol or places that you recommend going? And what are some of the things that you love the most about Russia?
Well, I guess the place to go is Moscow. It's a very interesting and wonderful city. If a person like many Iowans has had a chance to go and stay with a Russian family in a farm community or in a village somewhere like in Stavropol region, that's if you don't mind some inconveniences, then it's really very interesting, and that really leads me to the point that is the most interesting. There are really a lot of very wonderful people in Russia. There are a lot of unpleasant people in Russia also, but it's a safe country. I can be in the streets in Moscow, day and night. Has a wonderful transportation system. It's fairly cheap now for foreigners to travel there. And the average Russian family and the average Russian they're really quite wonderful people and very cultured. They actually probably, I know many of my Russian friends have read more of American literature than I have, of some of our, like Mark Twain and Jack London. These are authors that many Russians have read since they were very young. And the average Russian knows who their ballet dancers are and who their all kinds of musical artists are. And they travel on the metro. You'll often, virtually everyone traveling on the metro is reading a book all the time.
So what is your favorite food? That you think
McDonald's.
of. Oh no! That you think of as Russian. What would that be?
Oh.
I don't know what it would be.
Actually, the bread, and also the dairy products. Just there, you really can get a lot of very good fresh. The dairy products, like yogurt and kefir that they have there, really, they have a very large variety of interesting dairy products and breads. And as far as the average Russian menu in a restaurant, I'm not sure what I would recommend.
So are there any other interesting points that you want to bring out today that you'd like to share with Fairfield about Russia?
I think the main thing is that it is still a very interesting and wonderful place. It is a lot better place than it was a few years ago for foreigners. At the same time, for the average Russian, it's hard to find a Russian who thinks it's better today than it was 8 or 9 years ago, because there are many more uncertainties and difficulties presented to them in their life. And if the average American was faced with the kind of problems that the average Russian was faced with, I think we'd have another revolution here. So it's a really wonderful and interesting place, and I hope more people will visit there.
I'm sure that there will be a lot more, and it would be interesting to visit with you, say, in another 7 years to see the progress and changes that are coming about.
Okay, well, I think we've spent our time.
Yeah,
And I should mention once again that this show was sponsored by Farm Bureau Insurance. Pat Kessel helps pay for the money for the tape for our show, and you've been watching Opening Fairfield Doors, hosted by Connie Boyer and myself. And we look forward to bringing you another show very soon. And I'd like to thank you, Charles, for being here today and
Thank you for
sharing
inviting me.
and opening a door to Russia.
And maybe we'll come visit sometime.
I hope so.
Thanks.